Welcome to the scripture study on the RC Springs channel, here from Johannesburg, South Africa. In this first presentation, I will just do a brief outline of how Catholics read and understand Scripture. Scripture is, of course, divine revelation. And that divine revelation comes through our human senses, through our human society, through our human involvements. It is not that we are robots in the hands of God when He gives His revelation, but that our human comprehension, our human society, and our human understanding is also at work. We also believe as Catholics that what God wanted to reveal about His relationship with us is contained in the Scripture to an inerrant degree. At the same time, that message is couched in human terms, in terms of a society, and in terms of a language that now we do no longer have. The society from which the Scriptures emerged, that of Israel of the 2 millennia before Christ, and then of the 2 centuries after Christ, that world doesn't exist anymore. What is taken for granted in that society, we now have to investigate and appropriate for ourselves. The language of the revelation from the 2nd millennium before Christ until the time of Christ is in the Hebrew and Greek language. That Hebrew language is no longer used in everyday discourse, so even though Hebrew is still a living language, it has changed over time from biblical Hebrew through rabbinical medieval Hebrew into modern Hebrew. And in the same way, we would find difficulty in understanding English of even 1,000 years ago, or how much did we struggle not with Shakespeare during our school days. So the language of 2,000 years ago offers an even greater challenge for our comprehension and understanding, and we must be humble in the face of that distance in time. The Greek language also has undergone several major changes. The Greek language that existed from the time of Alexander to Jesus is different from the Greek used in Jesus' time, and is once again different, although related, to the Greek used today. In the same way that Portuguese, French, Spanish, and Italian rely on Latin, those languages have taken their own direction away from Latin. And that's only in the last 500-600 years. So imagine what a 2,000-4,000 year history is like in the development and the understanding of a language. So it is not only the language that we need to understand the society, we need to understand the way that people thought in that world. And that means we need to use all the tools at our disposal. The tools of archaeology, the tools of sociology, the tools of reconstructions of buildings to understand how people moved in their civic spaces, and various other skills like trying to find the clearest version of the Scriptures that represent how they were first written. The history of copying has fortunately been a very good one, a very accurate history of the copying of manuscripts before the printing press arrived in Europe around 500 years ago. But over time, changes, mispronunciations that become new words creep in. And it is also then the task of scholarship to try and determine what the most original version of the Scriptures that we have in our hands today, what that version was. Another thing we need to bear in mind is that Scripture is not all one thing. There are various types of writing in the Scripture. We know that Jesus preaches. We also know that he talks in parables. All of that is important. How things are said. Is it poetry? Is it history? Is it chemistry? Is it science? Is it astronomy? Those things are not always apparent as we look at a text. And so we need to take into account how language was used, how stories were told, how parables were transmitted, how poetry works in the original languages of Hebrew and Greek. So it's actually a very vast field, and many people specialize in different aspects of understanding Scripture. All these methods are used by the Catholic Church to enrich her understanding of Scripture, together with the tradition, the history of interpretation that has been handed on to us from the time of the Old Testament and through Jesus' own words and attitudes towards Scripture. Those things all play a role. There is only one way of interpreting Scripture that is excluded for us as Catholics, and that is fundamentalism. Now, what is fundamentalism? Fundamentalism is the attempt to reduce Scripture to one thing only, a factual telling of everything in it, without regard to how language changes, to how ideas develop, to how world views adjust in the light of a deeper and more pertinent scientific knowledge. It simply takes the Scripture as if it were a textbook written for us today. And in the Catholic point of view, that undervalues the richness of Scripture and hides much more than it attempts to reveal. So fundamentalism is excluded. How do we look at Scripture normally? We have an inheritance in our tradition from St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a Dominican brother of mine who lived 800 years ago. And the first thing we need to look at is what is literally there. Now, this isn't the same as literal fundamentalism. What is literally there? Who is speaking to whom? What are they actually saying? What sort of speech are they using? Are they giving commands? Are they talking in poetry? Or are they having a conversation? What is actually right there in the text as we look at it? And then we look at the spiritual meaning of the text and also what is called the analogical meaning. What are the symbolic values being revealed to us? The symbols within Scripture are many, varied, and extremely rich. And symbols contain much more than is immediately apparent. So the Scripture has a depth of symbol, a depth of grace, a depth of revelation that constantly challenges us, no matter how much we might know, to enter more deeply and more prayerfully, where we get the spiritual understanding of Scripture from, into the text, so that we can encounter God in our own time, because we are convinced that people in the ancient world also encountered God. So to sum up, there are various levels of interpretation, and there are various tools that we use to assist us. The tools of sociology, psychology, philosophy, archaeology, all the human sciences play their role. We look at the text itself, its grammar, its construction, the way that different episodes in Scripture relate to each other. What is excluded is reading the Scripture like a textbook that has no variation, that did not develop over a period of thousands of years, reflecting different levels of human understanding and reflecting very different human societies in which the Scripture emerged and was written down. To ignore all of that is to ignore the way God speaks to us through experience. In Scripture, the experience is that of our ancestors in the faith, that they wrote down, and the Christian tradition over the centuries has recognized as belonging to us, as echoing what we feel at this moment, what we feel, what we experience of God, simply because we are human and God is God. So welcome to this journey and welcome to this adventure.